Lovely. So welcome everyone for joining us today. I'm Jessica, a HR Director at JourneyHR, and I have the privilege of guiding today's discussion. We've got a brilliant panel lined up and I'll let them introduce themselves in a moment. But before we do that, I have a quick bit of housekeeping. Firstly, we're recording today's session, so if anyone in the audience wants to turn their camera off, then that's absolutely fine. Second, please can the audience turn their microphones off to reduce that background noise. You will have the opportunity at the end to ask your questions, and you can either put them in the chat function or you can just shout them out if you wish to do so. So why are we here today? Our last Future of Work event in January covered the incoming legislative changes, but we didn't really delve into the practical details of what business owners and HR teams need to do now to ensure that you're set up for success. So today we're going to give you just that, an overview of some of the practical things that you need in your toolkit as these changes come into force. We're going to focus on 3 key areas today, which we've identified as critical to support you through the change. They focus on policy and process, robust recruitment, and finally, performance management. And whilst these 3 areas are essential to include in today's discussion, they're not inclusive. So please reach out to me or the team if you're concerned about any of the other legislative changes being implemented, and we can advise accordingly. Our last slide today shares our contact details and the ways you can get in touch with myself and the team here at JourneyHR. So before we dive into the details, I'd love for each of our panelists to introduce themselves. Firstly, I'm Jess. I'm a HR Director at JourneyHR. I've more than 20 years experience now in the wonderful world of HR, and I've spent most of my career in the creative space, working with some brilliant brands before coming to Journey around 3 years ago. Holly.
Thank you, Jess. Hi, everyone. I'm Holly. I'm also an HR Director at JourneyHR. I have around 10 years experience working in the creative world and work with a variety of brands and creative companies within Journey, specifically advising leadership teams across all of those businesses.
Welcome today, Lydia.
Thank you. So I'm Lydia, I'm head of HR at JourneyHR, and similar to Holly, I've got around 10 years experience, but it's kind of across the creative industry, but also in the public sector and even financial services. So I've been around a few areas.
Great. Thanks, Lydia. It's great to have you on the team today. And Bradley, last but not least.
Yes, hello, I'm Bradley Geimer. I'm a HR consultant with around 9 years of experience, and I've been with JourneyHR for just over 2 years now. And my experience is predominantly financial services with a smidge of creative in there as well.
Thanks, Bradley. Wonderful. So let's get into the detail now. So Bradley, I think we'll start with you today. It'd be great if you can just set the scene and just give people a bit of an overview of what's happening with those legislative changes at the moment.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Jess. And good morning again, everyone. So I suppose a little bit of background context, almost just to set the scene today. So the Employment Rights Bill is now the Employment Rights Act 2025, and it became law on 18th of December 2025. The employment law changes included in this act will come into effect across 2026 and into 2027. I suppose the main implementation dates are spread across 4 main phases, which include February of this year, April 2026, October of this year, and then Jan 2027 as we move into 2027. In the next slide, we can just see which changes are coming or have already come into effect.
Great. So what are those kind of key milestones and the timings across those phases?
Yeah, definitely. In terms of what has almost already come into place, so for example, in February this year, this is when industrial action changes came into effect. So essentially, it will now be easier for employees to organise industrial action and have almost less barriers to achieving action moving forward. With also simplified balloting processes, in addition to making it essentially automatically unfair to dismiss employees simply for participating in the action. More recently, or literally just gone in this month, on the 6th of April, some big changes to family and sick leave became effective. So we saw paternity and parental leave become rights from day 1 of employment. In addition to that, simplified statutory sick pay counting came into force as well, in addition to a new type of leave, which allows essentially the surviving partner of a child's primary caregiver to take up to 52 weeks of leave, effectively almost mirroring the maternity leave entitlement. Looking forward into October, more changes are expected, with the main piece here being an increase to the duties in relation to sexual harassment. So essentially, organisations will need to have taken all reasonable steps to mitigate harassment in our workplaces. So there's plenty of change across the board here, but I suppose one of the major changes coming ahead of us is in January 2027, where the unfair dismissal threshold will be reducing from 2 years at the moment down to 6 months. This has many implications, which I think Holly and Lydia will explore later in the session. So I suppose combining all of these significant changes with the fact that business owners want more for less, businesses are struggling with staff cost ratio and revenue generating roles, and of course the major disruption that AI has brought, there is a lot for businesses and HR professionals to be thinking about and preparing for.
Yeah, thanks, Bradley. There is certainly a lot happening this year. I guess from your perspective, from that priority perspective, which of the policies do businesses need to prioritise right now to avoid that future risk?
Yeah, so for me, I believe the most immediate priority is the 6th of April changes. So as I mentioned, paternity leave and parental leave entitlements moved to day one rights, in addition to that new leave called bereaved partner paternity leave being introduced. So, therefore, the wording in our policies and in our handbooks will need to be updated to reflect these. Aligning and embedding these with existing family policies will be super important. Moreover, I think ahead of October as well, the duty to prevent sexual harassment strengthens, taking it to all reasonable steps. So, we need to be hot on reviewing our dignity at work or anti-harassment policies, refreshing training or implementing training if we haven't already, and making clear reporting routes clear to escalate any concerns. And this is all especially in mind that sexual harassment disclosures are also expected in October to fall under whistleblowing protections. So there's enhanced protections coming down the line as well. And I suppose finally on this, ahead of January 27, where those unfair dismissal claim period reduces from 2 years down to 6 months, I would really recommend sense checking our performance management processes, our capability and disciplinary policies, and all the documentation and guidance around those as well, just so that they continue remaining fit for purpose. Again, I don't want to steal too much of Lydia and Holly's slides there.
Yeah, thanks, Bradley. That's really helpful. And those policies are going to be key to update, aren't they, as we move through this year? In terms of employment contracts, where do you see the biggest gaps in contracts that could have employers exposed once those new regulations come into force?
Yes, so I think for me, the biggest gap as a result of these changes is that currently a lot of contracts rely on quite long probation periods. So with that unfair dismissal protections reducing to 6 months, we should be seeking to reduce probation periods within our contracts, revisit these probation processes as well to ensure that they are clearly communicating role expectations from day one, that there are regular documented check-ins, and prompt decisions need to be made before individuals reach that 6-month mark. Furthermore, with regards to fixed-term contracts, these are going to essentially become a little bit more of a weak spot for organisations. Therefore, I would recommend within the actual FTC contracts that we're building in, the genuine reason for the FTC contracts, clarity on start and end dates, notice, early termination rights, and essentially how the role will end, including consultation steps if redundancy is likely to be the outcome there.
Thanks, Bradley. I think one of the ways we've seen clients navigate these turbulent financial times in the last 18 months is by making redundancies and then plugging those skill gaps with fixed term contractors. And we see that a lot. So how do you see those incoming changes impacting those who are currently relying on fixed term contractors, and what can they do to mitigate against that?
Yeah, definitely. It's going to be a big change. So almost ending a fixed term contract after the 6-month mark becomes much, much higher risk. So FTCs should be used really for genuine time limited needs only. So, you know, project cover, you know, seasonal work demand perhaps, and of course the classic, you know, parental leave cover. Not so much, we shouldn't be using FTCs as much as a try before you buy workforce strategy, which I know some organizations may previously have used before moving them on to permanent contracts. So I suppose consider where appropriate, where alternatives might be appropriate almost. So, you know, for consultants or freelancers, of course, there is a bit of a cost consideration here. You know, we would always advise to make sure that the engagement model you're using matches the reality on the ground. And I suppose further to this, making sure that you're building in decision points into the FTC life cycle, you know, the 3 or 4 month point, almost as a line in the sand to decide whether to extend the FTC, to convert the individual to perm, or potentially start a exit process. You know, I'd always encourage people to remember to keep a paper trail for the business reasons, you know, ensure you've got performance feedback in there and any consultations that you may have had to date. And I suppose finally, you know, be really explicit at the start and towards the end of the FTC. What triggers the role ending, what consultation will look like there, and what the likely reason is to be. I think in practice, many FTCs ending will need to be treated almost as a redundancy process, unless there is a really strong, some other substantial reason, justification. So, you know, a defined cover or, you know, arrangement ending.
Thanks, Bradley. That's really helpful, and some quite significant changes there coming into play. I'm going to come to you, Holly, next. With the direction of the UK legislative changes placing that greater emphasis on fairness and transparency, how should organisations evolve their performance management processes to stay compliant and effective as these come into force?
Yeah, of course. You know, as Bradley has commented on there, the direction of travel in the UK is really quite clear, in that the earlier access to fair, unfair dismissal rights and the higher scrutiny on process means that there really needs to be a stronger emphasis on fairness and transparency. You know, organisations need to move from retrospective processes where, you know, you might be assessing performance once a year through an appraisal process to much more of a structured, evidence-based way of managing things. None of this is really widely that different from what we would recommend our clients doing currently. However, in reality, the onus on it and the risk on it is, you know, greatly reduced at the moment, with there being 2 years until you get unfair dismissal rights. So the real difference is placed on the impact and the result of not having this in place. And what I mean by that is that there is a much higher legal risk and cost now associated with getting this wrong. You know, you had 2 years to kind of figure it out and to provide performance feedback kind of however you wished within that 2-year framework. Obviously, we would hope that wasn't the case, but, you know, it was much kind of reduced legal and cost risk in that 2-year period. So there are 3 kind of key shifts that I would recommend businesses really thinking about, and that is moving from subjective to slightly more structured processes. And when I'm talking about these shifts, I'm talking about not just before 6 months, also moving beyond that 6-month period as well. So this relates to continuous performance management within kind of an employee's lifetime within your business. So what subjective to structured looks like. Managers really do need to know what good looks like within the first 30, 60, 90 days of them being with you. Too many passes or fails within probation, I would say, is based on guessing or them not really knowing what good looks like, or that they have options to play with. So managers really need to know what the options that they have to play with are, whether that's passing and why they're passing, whether that's extending, and the criteria for what enables an extension, or whether that's failing. And they really should be assessing both performance, i.e. the technical competencies of that role, but also potential. And potential can look like many things. That's, the speed of learning, how people respond to feedback, people's judgment in decision making, the ways that they might adapt in how they work internally, cross teams. So there's many things that you need to be assessing during that probation period time. What I would say is missing from quite a few organisations is really clearly defined competency frameworks and expectations across all roles and all levels within a business. And you can quite easily kind of build these out, developing competency frameworks. And what that does is it really helps remove the subjectivity around whether someone is performing at the right level. And it also reduces the reliance on manager opinion. So, having one manager in another department having a very different standard of expectation to, another in another kind of division of the business. So it really helps make things objective and structured. The other thing I would say, Jess, is moving away from a simple annual process of reviewing performance to a more continuous process. And again, lots of organisations are already doing this, so that's fantastic. So it might just be more of a check-in in terms of, is this working? But this old one point in time, very reflective appraisal process, I don't think is going to hugely serve businesses moving forward. And I think it needs to be far more centred around where people are at based on the competencies, both technically and behaviourally. So like I said, assessing via a competency framework how people are doing, and really making sure that's super clear in terms of where their stretch is, where they're performing well, etc. That also means much earlier identification of issues, particularly within that first 3 to 5 months, given the upcoming changes. So really, really identifying and speaking about where those concerns are, really early on in that process. We can't really afford for, under the new process and legislation, kind of surprise performance concerns. We really need to know about it much earlier on. The last thing I would say is moving away from an informal way of managing performance to more of an evidence-based way of managing performance. And this can be a cultural shift, particularly within creative agencies as well. Evidence way of managing performance doesn't need to be, tons and tons of information and like you're trying to catch someone out. But what it does mean is consistent documentation of, what good looks like, what are the expectations that you have set for that individual, whether that's in the first 30 days of their time with you, or whether that's, 5 years into being with you. Also what support has been provided if there are concerns around performance. And lastly, really making sure that you have evidence that the employee has had the opportunity to improve. So, what's that time frame that you've provided people with in order to meet those expectations?
Yeah, thanks, Holly. There's a lot to think about there, isn't there? And I know lots of our clients are coming forward now asking us to really review their entire performance processes. Right through that life cycle. So I would encourage, if people are concerned about this area and you haven't started to review it yet, do come and chat to the team here, come and chat to Holly or myself. We're more than happy to kind of give you some guidance around that. Holly, in terms of the risks of not getting this right, what do you see are the biggest risks in that traditional performance management approach under the new legal landscape, and how can people mitigate against them?
Yeah, I think, it's not just the legal landscape. I think it's also about breaking habit. So I think, we're in a habit of understanding in most cases that we have 2 years to basically follow a looser performance management process. You would hope that people still had evidence and they gave people opportunity, so on and so forth. But the reality is that it's a looser process that people are following under 2 years. So there is significant risk. And I would say that's based on habit more than the legislation. Obviously, the legislation is changing, but actually what you need to do when someone's got unfair dismissal rights hasn't drastically changed, just the time frame has. So the key thing that we see is definitely the lack of documentation. So, we see a lot of the time people coming forward and saying, we've had a conversation, I've provided lots of feedback to this individual, but there's no paper trail of it. And that's not just frustrating for the manager, it's sometimes frustrating for HR teams as well, because it means we have to start all over again, which is not productive for the business, for the manager, and it's probably really demotivating for the employee as well, and tension's going to kind of rise there. So without sufficient written evidence that you've been trying to manage this person's performance, you've set expectations, you're using really clear competency frameworks, you're going to struggle to defend decisions if you were to then eventually let that person go without that proper paperwork. So the mitigation for that, I would say, is introducing, a light, particularly before 6 months, introduce a lightweight paper trail and consistent documentation. So that could be summaries of your one-to-ones and really getting into a habit of what you've discussed, what the improvements are, what the actions that you and the employee are going to take to kind of work towards that, and follow-ups. And again, these can simply be emails that you send to the individual. They can be notes that you both have access to. Just make sure that it's stored somewhere that you can rely on later if you did need to take a more formal approach to managing that person's performance. The second thing I would say as well, which I have kind of spoken to in the last question you asked me, Jess, is that inconsistent management standards, and that's purely because managers aren't being given the tools to understand what good looks like at either each level or each individual role within a business. And this is where competency and behavioural frameworks become so important and so useful for managers. They really help set what the standard is, what the expectation is per role and per level, and it gives them a bedrock to approach those conversations from, that both the manager and the employee have access to. So it's very transparent and everyone has the same level of information from the onset. So I would say the mitigation really is there, creating standardized frameworks, looking at the competencies that are required within your business, potentially rating definitions. So, at what level do you expect someone to be performing against that competency? Do you expect them to be exceeding it, meeting it, leading in it? And really, having that super, super clear so people understand how competent they need to be at that competency. What's the proficiency level? So that then helps set calibrations across teams to ensure that that expectation is consistent. The other thing that I would say is a real concern is the delayed performance management. So kind of coming into issues too late, too far gone. So, managers have been trying to navigate that issue maybe too informally, and then it comes to a point where we need to kind of move quickly on it. We don't have the sufficient kind of ability to do that. So what we would say is the mitigation for that is really making sure now you're reviewing your probation process and making sure that is robust enough, and making sure that managers are super confident in front-loading performance conversations. A lot of people want to give people the benefit of the doubt. People are new to the business. So how can we have those conversations sensitively, but also motivationally as well? We want to be providing clear, constructive feedback within those processes. So making sure that we're introducing those clear review points within probation periods and setting that criteria for success. Post-probation, what I would say is that you need to ground decisions in performance frameworks. So this is where people do have unfair dismissal rights. and you need to ensure that you are following a full performance management process if you have real concerns. Bradley spoke about this earlier on, but I would recommend that employers are reviewing their performance management frameworks to ensure that you do have sufficient flexibility in that process, and it's not so rigid as you must follow first written warning, second written warning, final written warning. You need to make sure that your managers aren't constrained to those rigid ways of following a process, and where circumstances are justified, you can accelerate through that process more quickly if needs be. You need to have very clear justifications, and it has to be proportionate in order to do that. But that might be the most commercial, kind of sensible route to ensure that that does allow for flexibility. It can't look like a tick box exercise as well. You need to make sure that that is genuine, and there is really clear judgment as to why you may go straight to a final written warning versus a first. And then finally is the over-reliance on subjective kind of feedback. So that vague language such as, oh, it just doesn't feel right, they don't feel like the right fit. That's going to be incredibly difficult to legally defend now, and it's going to increase, obviously, your legal and cost risks there as well. So the mitigation is weaving in observable kind of behavioural and value-based behaviours into those competency frameworks.
Thanks, Holly. There's a lot to think about there, and a lot of this will fall onto those managers. They're going to be key in this process. So, Holly, in your view, how can managers be better equipped to have those consistent, well-documented performance conversations that stand up to that increased scrutiny?
Yeah, completely. They're the front line of many of these changes, unfortunately. So there's a lot of information for them to absorb. I think really organisations need to massively focus on practical capability now and not theory. They absolutely need to know about the new the reduced legal risk and the cost associated with that. But we don't want to paralyze managers, right, in becoming really afraid that they're going to do something wrong. So we need to increase their capability, and a lot of the time that comes down to confidence, the confidence in being able to have these conversations and having them in a constructive way, which doesn't end in them being on the firing line or them being attacked for doing something wrong. So we need to give them structure. And that leads back to what I've just mentioned previously. What does good look like? As a business, really ask yourself, department by department, do we know technically and behaviourally what good looks like? And how does that increase over time as people develop within your business and get promoted, so on and so forth. So make sure you have a framework which helps them determine how to assess performance and what specifically they need to be looking for. Otherwise, you're letting it be kind of up to whichever manager is kind of dealing with the situation. So simple templates such as one-to-ones, performance, how to kind of manage performance concerns and follow-up actions. I would say training for real life conversations. So this is more behavioural training now, I would say. Role play, how to actually give direct feedback early on, how to do that in a motivational way whilst also creating clarity, how to handle difficulty without delay, how to actually take yourself away from other people to give that feedback, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, how to give feedback without being ambiguous, making sure that it lands appropriately. These are the types of training sessions and workshops that I would very much encourage people to focus on now, because I think based on all the conversations, I think everyone on the call would agree that a lot of the time it does come down to confidence. So it's building that confidence. And all this ladders up, right? You build your manager's confidence by ensuring they have the right documentation in place that they can use, the right frameworks in place, and providing with them with that training. So you are, what's the right word? You're reducing the amount of effort it takes for them to manage, right? You're giving them all of the helpful tools to do that. And then ongoing support. So it can't just be a one-off training and then you expect your managers to know how to do all of this straight away. You're going to have new managers coming into your business who may not have had the same level of training. You're going to have people being promoted into management positions. So make sure that you have regular manager forums or clinics where they have access to your HR teams, your people teams, and really make sure that you're building a culture where HR are involved in early stage issues so you can help prevent them from escalating any further, and ground everything in real life examples. I would say I think that's where people learn and take away the most from those situations.
Thanks, Holly. That's great. And we've developed a lot of training to support this, right? So we can
Absolutely.
go into our clients and support with those conversations. Thanks, Holly. I think a final point for this section is what practical steps can organisations take right now to make sure their performance management frameworks are both legally robust but genuinely supportive of employee development.
Yeah, of course. And I think this is going to be a recap of everything that I've just said there. So kind of 5 immediate actions that I think businesses should really kind of prioritise. I would very much ask yourself the question, do we know what good looks like? And would your managers easily be able to answer that question? So define clear performance frameworks. That could be 6 to 7, core competencies across your entire business, which you then build out department-specific frameworks for people to assess performance against. Weave in both technical competencies and behavioural competencies as well, and really ensure that you start to then set that clear expectation at each level. I would really encourage having a look at your appraisal process. And if you can, shift away from that long kind of subjective, reflective annual appraisal and embed it in competency proficiencies, setting very clear KPIs, and making sure that you've got 360 feedback in there as well. Really making sure that your regular one-to-ones are your primary mechanism for managing performance. It shouldn't be your appraisal. Implement structured probations. So I think, as Brad mentioned, this is a key area that people are going to have to look at. A lot of businesses after COVID changed their probation periods to 6 months. That might not serve you anymore, because you definitely need to be making decisions as to whether you're passing, failing or extending before 6 months. So have a look at how you want to structure those. We'd recommend a 4-month probation period with the ability to extend by 4 to 6 weeks. So you're definitely making a call as to whether they've passed, failed, or being extended before they gain unfair dismissal rights. To have a look at that both in contracts and your handbooks, and make sure managers are informed of that as well. I would make sure that you are diarising or making it really easy for you to ensure that you're having 1 month check-ins and subsequent check-ins after that, so that you're giving live feedback, and also make sure that you're setting out really clear decision pathways in terms of what options managers have available to them during that probation period. So whether that's, how do I make a decision as to whether they're passing, failing or extending. And if performance concerns do arise during probation, make sure that you follow a short, PIP or structured feedback process, so that individuals know way before the end of their probation as to whether they're going to fail or pass. That shouldn't be a surprise to them at the end of it. It needs to be kind of a fair process on both sides. The other thing I'd say is, standardise your documentation. So take this moment to review all of your documentation. Do you have very clear guidance of how to have one-to-ones? What should be included in those? Do you have clear improvement plans, performance improvement plans for your managers as well? Make sure that all decisions based on performance are traceable. Make sure you have that paper trail that you can rely on if you need to take anything further. And then finally, that training. Make sure your managers are comfortable with all of these changes that are coming into play. They really are at the front line of all of these changes that are due to happen or have happened over the last year or so. mandatory training on how to give feedback, how to manage underperformance, when to bring HR involved into those processes, how to use competency frameworks as well. If you're building those out, don't just build them and then send them across to managers. Make sure they really understand kind of the nuts and bolts of them and how to actually use them effectively. And then that calibration across teams, make sure that there is a consistent standard of how people are managing, so that you don't get unfair accusations that it's being managed differently across your business. So 5, hopefully fairly easy, but you need to take some time to consider them, things that you can think about and take away within your business.
Thanks, Holly. That's wonderful. And obviously, if anyone needs any support with these areas, you can reach out to Holly or indeed anyone on the JourneyHR team. Right, I think we'll come over to you, Lydia, now. In terms of the incoming changes, the talent market and the recruitment market is going to shift slightly. So what are the biggest watch outs that you see in today's competitive and evolving talent market?
Yeah, of course. And I think Holly and Brad have set a really good backdrop for all the bits that I'll now touch on. So I might be a little bit repetitive, but bear with me. So the first one being the Employment Rights Act that Brad really laid out clearly for us has fundamentally shifted the playing field. So any reactive hiring is now creating a bit of a risk. And that is not uncommon to have reactive hiring, particularly in agencies. If you've suddenly won a new client and you haven't got the team to deliver against it, or someone's left unexpectedly because you haven't maybe been reviewing your talent mapping. So we're almost, as Holly said earlier, in a habit of reactively hiring, but that now comes with a bigger risk because we have the 6 months protection in place. So, and that's from January 27. However, our hires from summer this year will ultimately fall into that. So we need to be proactively planning against this. So any poor hiring decisions are no longer just kind of a performance or cultural issue. It can become a legal one quite quickly. So that rigor in the selection process is absolutely vital. And I'll come on to this a bit more in my next slide, but having a very structured interview panel and questions and more than one person making those decisions really will be key. The second watch out here is thinking more about retention being the new recruitment, in the sense of hiring costs are rising and exit risks are increasing. So you can't afford to treat retention how businesses maybe have historically, where it's, a soft engagement only issue. Thinking about upskilling, career development, manager capability, which Holly just took us through, are really meaningful and they're core risk mitigation strategies now. So it's quite a volatile external market. So keeping your best people is probably more defensible a talent decision that you could be making right now. The third is the pressure on workforce flexibility. So again, Brad gave us a really good backdrop around fixed term contracts, and temporary and fixed term hiring hasn't disappeared, but they are now going to require a far stronger business rationale as to why you're using them. So the non-renewal of a fixed term contract is legally classified as dismissal, and that is not new. But what has changed, of course, is that length of service. So from 6 months onwards now, which is not a long time for your FTCs, they now have this protection in place. So many agencies and many organisations use and rely on flexible workforce patterns because they're seen as a low risk solution. But really now they need to be auditing why they may be using fixed term contractors, how often are they using them, and should they actually be permanent staff members. So really understanding that under the new framework and understanding the decisions behind those mitigations is really important. So the bottom line for my biggest kind of 3 watch outs here is that any kind of previous flexible workforce models are no longer as low risk as they would have been previously. So we really need to be auditing those decisions, also looking at the hiring process and having a clear framework in place for that, and then seeing your retention strategy as also a defensible mechanism moving forward in this new framework.
We've just had a question come through here. Oops. Is it correct that temp workers aren't in the scope of the changes in unfair dismissal rights?
No, it is still employees, but when we're talking about temp workers, we're talking about fixed term contractors and fixed term employees who are employees. So again, the unfair dismissal has not changed. The non-renewal of their contract has always been that way, but it is the 2-year mark that has changed for them.
Yeah, and Lydia, when should employers really start to review this? Is there a deadline that you would put in place to say by this date you need to have reviewed your flexible workers and decided whether to keep them on as permanent staff or to indeed terminate them?
I think it comes back to summer, because if we're thinking about, again, January 27 is the proposed change for this, but what that means is if you have somebody starting in October, let's say, you've only got 3 months until they then fall into January. So then you've only got 3 months left. So really, you need to be auditing your current working practices and need for staff as soon as now, with the understanding that from summer onwards, those decisions are really pivotal.
Great. Thank you. So thinking about the recruitment space, what are the most effective ways to ensure that you're recruiting not just the best candidate on paper, but the right long-term fit for your organisation, given that they're going to be permanent employees after 6 months, or that the unfair dismissal right is reducing down?
So I see this as great hiring isn't about just filling a role or a vacancy. It's about building a team that will still be thriving in, say, 18 months' time from now. So the businesses that do this well typically apply these 4 disciplines. So the first is really anchoring any hiring decisions in your values and your behaviours, not just that candidate's experience. So you need to be really crystal clear as an organisation on what you stand for. And as Holly has said, what does good look like day to day? What are your values and behaviours? So in an interview panel, value-based questions really move you away from any rehearsed answers that candidates may be prepping in the background, and it brings more insight into how they might actually make decisions, how they behave under pressure, how they handle challenges, and how they would work with the wider team. And some skills can be taught, but behaviours are much harder to shift, and that is a really vital thing to be considering when you're hiring. The second one is testing reality rather than just talking about it. So again, if you really want to know how well someone will perform in role, I wouldn't rely on hypotheticals too much. I would use real life scenarios, actually have some problem solving exercises and task-based interviews. You're going to learn far more about how someone thinks and how they would behave in a certain situation, how they prioritise and react, versus just listening to them say, this is how I would respond. And then I would build in multiple perspectives. And we spoke about this a fair bit, but a diverse interview panel isn't just about kind of fairness, it's decision quality. And under this new framework, that is really, really key. So if we think back to having quite rushed hiring processes because we have a gap suddenly in the team, that is where we have the risk. So having just one person making hiring decisions can really have some blind spots. So when you have more than one person at different levels, in different functions in the business, it reduces any bias, but it also reduces any hiring being one person's gut feeling, and it's more evidence-based. And the last one here, I really like this bit, but hire for culture add, not culture fit. So again, the biggest hiring mistake happens when businesses kind of confuse comfort for compatibility. So the goal isn't to kind of replicate what we already have in place, but it's to bring in more diverse thinking and really someone who can challenge us to grow more. So I would definitely think about that, and that really is how teams evolve rather than stagnate. So to put it really simply, the long-term fit comes from clarity and evidence and diversity, and it's not based on just kind of chemistry or a CV alone. So I would define the behaviours of the business, not just the competencies that you need for that role, and make sure that you're bringing that into every stage of the interview process. So it's really clear to the candidate what you stand for as a business. And as Holly said, what does good look like? I would make sure that you have real world test scenarios in there as well. Never hire from a single viewpoint. Make sure you've got multiple people in there that are bringing different perspectives, and then really ask yourself when you're making a decision, is this a candidate going to replicate what we've already got, or are they going to help us grow?
Thank you, Lydia. Moving on now, what do you think a truly effective onboarding and induction process looks like in 2026 and beyond? And where do you see organisations still falling short?
So it isn't just an admin process that I think often businesses see this as. It's a performance and a long-term belonging strategy. So, and that's where I think, again, a lot of businesses are quite misaligned still. So onboarding starts before day one, and we talk about this a lot with our clients, but the pre-arrival matters more than most people think. So access to documents, clarity on role, early connection with peers and manager, that builds confidence and belonging. It doesn't just magically appear at 9 a.m. on their first day. People are deciding how they feel about a business way before that. It starts at interview stage and then into their first day. And then also, Holly's talked about this with the framework, and that is really, really essential that all managers can access this. However, we also need to be able to personalise our onboarding per role. And that really is talking about having a consistent framework, but you adapt the expectations and any kind of learning curves and success criteria to the individual and to that role. A one size fits all is not always sufficient when we're looking at a high performance culture. And then really crucially, onboarding is measured in months, not days. And this is really where a lot of organisations fall short. We need to have at least 90 days to really set people up for success. So what does, again, good look like at 30, 60, 90 days? Because people need space to learn, to practice, to make mistakes and then learn from them, and not just absorb all the information and policies on day one and then be expected to fly. So they're the key ones, and the really standout one for me is manager-led onboarding. And we've talked a lot about the role, the bigger role of a manager within the new legislation, but the data is very clear. A line manager is one of the single biggest variables in onboarding success, but also an employee's experience in work. So when managers are capable, when they're available, accessible, and they're accountable, onboarding feels more human and meaningful. So, and when they're not, no amount of process can necessarily make up for that lack of. And then crucially here, having measures of success. So if there's ambiguity around what does good look like at 30, 60, 90 days, that's where it really falls down for the employee and for the business. So we really need to make sure that we are documenting that and people know what they're working towards.
Thanks, Lydia. That's great. When it comes to probation periods, how can employers strike the balance between supporting those new hires to succeed and making those confident, timely decisions if things actually aren't working out? Because sometimes they just don't work out.
They don't, exactly. And getting probation right in the new framework is more important than ever. But again, as we've talked about with a lot of these processes, nothing has fundamentally changed. This should still be how we treat probations now. And it's not about being harsher or risk adverse when the changes come into play in 27. It's about treating a probation period as a supported assessment period for both parties. So the balance starts from really clear expectations from day one. Again, too many probations will fail because there's a lack of clear success criteria and people don't know what does good mean, what am I working towards? And for managers as well, that's really important that they have that definition, and that clarity is what can have lead to confident decision making later down the line when you need to come to a decision. The second is having regular and structured check-ins. And this is in probation, crucial, but throughout the entire employee journey. And it's a really simple thing that often gets overlooked. Having that dedicated time with an employee and a manager is really, really pivotal. Effective probation doesn't rely on issues bubbling up and then you have a decision at the end of that process. It's about having open feedback loops constantly, so there isn't a surprise when you get to month 4. Also in here we've got performance and potential, and again I really like this, and I think it's something that organisations do need to be thinking about for that long-term fit. So output matters, it absolutely does, but so does trajectory. So is this person learning? Are they showing the behaviours that we need in our business? Are they integrating with the team? And are they showing the behaviours that will matter over time? And really focusing on that from both sides is really important. And finally, Holly talked to this a fair bit, but there needs to be a clear decision pathway. And this is really down to the HR teams and for us as well, when we're thinking about when would we pass someone, when would we extend, and when would we fail? What are the criteria that would come to that conclusion? When do you involve HR? And how open have you been with the individual about the potential options that are there? That is absolutely crucial. So for HR teams, they need to be making sure there's an accessible framework in place, and managers need to understand that as well. So as a kind of a summary, that it's a real mindset shift, I'd say. Probation shouldn't feel like it's a threat that's hold over kind of new hires. It needs to be a shared commitment to getting it right for both parties.
Thanks, Lydia. That's great. And thanks to the panelists today. We're nearly at the end now, and in a second, I'll give you the opportunity for any questions. Genuinely hope this has been useful for everyone. Before we head off, I just wanted to take you through a couple of toolkits that we have developed to support all businesses of all shapes and sizes as we move through this period. If you're interested in exploring either of these, you can come and speak with us, and I'll share our emails at the end, or we've got our general inquiries at Journey email here. The first is a modular offering, that on the left, for those who don't have lots in place, and you can really pick a mix from this list and the areas that you need the most. So we start with a risk assessment, showing you the areas that you need support in to ensure you're both compliant and that you're setting yourself up for success. We can then support with a whole host of activities, from reviewing your policies and contracts and operational processes to make sure they're robust and they'll stand the test, and suggesting improvements as we run along in terms of the performance and recruitment offerings. And we also offer training for managers. So we have a 45-minute virtual training session to take managers through all these legislative changes and what they need to know, including their responsibilities, but more importantly, what happens if they don't get it right. And we have lots of training for managers on giving effective feedback and performance, etc. So do visit our website or come and chat to us if you want more information on the training offering. The second toolkit on the right here is really for those who have those operational processes in place, but who need to strengthen their performance infrastructure. So that is going to be one step further to focus on performance capabilities, training managers to manage those performance conversations proactively and fairly. What I'd like to do now is give you guys the opportunity to either put any questions that you have in the chat function, or to shout out if you want to. There's one question that's come in here from Lisa, which is on fixed term contracts. If you have a contract that is 1 year long, so a mat leave cover contract, does that constitute or trigger a redundancy at the end of the contract as it's been agreed? Holly, I'm going to put that one out to you if that's okay.
Of course. Yeah, so this is an area that a lot of businesses are wishing to have a bit more information on. It's a bit of a complicated one. In terms of a fixed term contract where it's explicitly for a reason or a project such as redundancy, mat leave, then the non-renewal of that contract is highly unlikely to be treated as an unfair dismissal in law, because it's been very, very clearly stated that the reason for that person being engaged with the business is for a very short period of time due to someone going off on leave. The only instant where, if that person's contract wasn't renewed and the actual reason for that was because the work had just diminished or had ceased, then it may be that a redundancy process should have been followed. However, in most cases that won't be the case. It will simply be because the existing employee will have returned, and therefore that mat leave won't be required anymore. The key thing to make super clear and transparent from the onset is the reason for that fixed term contract, and as and when it will end, and also engage in providing that feedback and that decision earlier than what the contract date says. If it said January 2029, I would encourage you to be having that conversation that is indeed the case, at least 2 months before that date actually arises, so that employee has clarity. So hopefully that answers the question.
Thanks, Holly. We've got another one come here from Ali. So for organisations that feel they're already addressing this internally, what are the signs that they might still benefit from external expertise? Lydia, I'm going to pop this one over to you, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course. And I guess, Ali, when you're discussing this, I guess you mean all the steps we've talked about here today, because there are quite a few actions. And I think the key thing for having HR expertise is because it is changing all the time. A lot of these changes are still in proposal stage for next year, and we're keeping up to date with as many legal changes as we possibly can. So for any businesses, it can feel quite overwhelming to make sure that your policies are up to date, your managers are trained, and we're doing this every day. So I would still urge people to come and get our advice, and we can do an audit of any policies you've got in place. As Jess has talked about, we have many training sessions that we can go through with managers, and we can make sure that businesses are fully equipped, because as we've spoken about, there is a lot to digest and make sure that we're covered against.
Yeah, there's a lot of moving parts there, isn't there? Are there any more questions from our audience today? Emma, there's a question from you here. Oh, excellent quality presentation. Thank you very much, Emma. Right, so before we say goodbye, I just want to thank our lovely panelists. All our emails are here on the screen. If you want to reach out to us separately, that's absolutely fine. We'd also love it. There's a QR code here. If you have a couple of minutes to complete a feedback form, that would be great. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what types of topics you'd like to hear from us in the future. And if you want to sign up to hear more about our future events, then you can as well. I will share this out with you via email after as well. But thank you so much to everyone for joining us today. Goodbye.